So good, I assume. So thank you, Sarah and Doreen, for making this possible. Thank you, Holland Society of New York. Excited to be here, and thanks to everyone who's listening. So, in 1655, Adriaan van der Donck published his Beschrijvingen van Nieuw-Nederland, Descriptions of New Netherland, informing for the first time a white Dutch audience about the colonial land claim that had become known as New Netherland, covering parts of today's states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware in the US. This publication was part of an effort to stimulate the emigration to New Netherland and to convince the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621 to stimulate the Dutch trade in the West Indies, to support this initiative. The primary tactic of this kind of literature was to make the destination as appealing as possible. So the New World in general was often described as a kind of garden, waiting for European hands to be brought into culture. Thus, Van der Donck presented New Netherland as a place with almost unlimited potential. Compared to the young Dutch Republic, the colony's natural provision won in every aspect. In stronger terms, the renowned Dutch poet Jacob Steendam, who lived in New Amsterdam, declared a few years later that New Netherland was the land where milk and honey flow, the province where herbs grow like thistles, and the place where Aaron's rod blossoms, concluding that this is Eden. Van der Donck, a resident of New Netherland since the early 1640s, described the many products that the landscape provided for the Dutch settlers. There were so many oaks, hickories, pines, spruces, cedars, chestnuts, and beeches, the list goes on, that they were almost too plentiful and in the way. Similarly, the land provided everything that was normally found in kitchen and herb gardens, including, but not limited to, various types of lettuce, cabbage, fennel, rosemary, lavender, and garlic. It's important to note here that while the Dutch were claiming to praise some kind of wilderness, they were actually admiring a landscape managed and cultured by local indigenous people, among them the Lenape, Mohican, and Mohawk. To appeal to his Old World audience, Van der Donck understood that just new and plenty would not get the job done. Thus, his description lists also the fruit-bearing trees and flowers that the Dutch had successfully transplanted from the Dutch Republic to North America. In these descriptions of the colony, Van der Donck blurred the lines between different types of gardens that Europeans would encounter in New Netherland, from the metaphorical and mystical to the concrete and practical, re-emphasizing that making the jump across the Atlantic would be rewarding, but also arguing that the New World was not as strange and otherworldly as it had been before. Gardens, in a colonial context, thus also functioned as a reminder of the mother country, as they imbue places with identity and made new places home. Landscape and garden historians have identified 4 kinds of European garden in early America. First, colonial gardens functioned as living laboratories for the European gardens where plants from all over the continent were gathered to study, experiment, and export. Second, the American colonies provided a variety of non-European climatic conditions in which botanists and horticulturists could experiment with plants imported from other imperial outskirts for food, medicine, timber, or ornamentals. Third, American gardens were the locations that facilitated the spread of native plants to different regions within the colonies. Experimental planting slowly expanded the popularity of mainly ornamental plants. And finally, colonial gardens were an emotional place instead of a utilitarian one. Information on and archaeological remains of early colonial gardens are scarce, leading to mostly utilitarian classifications of the garden culture. But gardens became powerful metaphors for improvement, progress, and culture. Especially plantations in the American South, with their large mansions and accompanying gardens, were imbued with ideas of building a society that was independent from its European counterpart and thriving. That is, only for a particular group of colonists that did not have to struggle to survive the harsh conditions of settling on non-European land. These garden categories come from studies of 18th century Virginia, but what of this can we see established or emerging in 17th century New Netherland? The Dutch Republic was during the 17th century one of the major European states, and its riches were spent on architecture, art, furnishings, and gardens. Because there were exceptional horticulturalists, much of the emphasis in gardens was on the cultivations of flowers and fruit. In this talk, I will briefly take you through the meaning of early modern Dutch gardens to establish a sort of landscape and garden cosmology. Dutch merchants and colonists carried this cosmology with them when traveling to and from colonial outposts in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Zooming in on New Netherland, what kind of gardens could be found there, and in what ways did they tie into the larger network of gardens? In other words, I will try to answer how the Dutch familiarized themselves with the landscape of the New World, and also how the Dutch familiarized that landscape with them. Early modern Dutch culture has been defined as a long-developed attitude towards the management of created or safeguarded land. The young republic of the Low Countries, while created in the late 16th century to revolt against Spanish oppression, was indeed intensely connected to its landscape and the waters that flowed around, through, and sometimes over it. The geography of the republic, especially around its most populous and globally connected western provinces with cities like Alkmaar and Haarlem, but also Amsterdam, was the result of intense labor and creative inventions that aimed to create space for economic benefit in the shape of agriculture, where there were first lakes and wetlands. This had also seeped through into the Dutch art of gardening that, in the 17th century, was characterized by geometrical layouts interspersed with canals and embellished with flowered parterres. The symbolical ties between the newly created land and its gardens were so strong that the Republic itself became identified with the garden and its people with gardeners. Gardener of the House of Orange, Jan van der Groen, wrote in the introduction to the well-known The Dutch Gardener from 1669 about the pleasures of living in the Low Countries, especially our small but blessed Holland. And I quote, and you see the text here in the original Dutch. Here are as many manors, pleasure gardens, and country estates as in France. Besides the princely estates and gardens, we can see those smaller in scale and status around Amsterdam in the former lake of Diemen, and on the lands surrounding the cities of Leiden, The Hague, Haarlem, and Alkmaar, as well as the drained lakes in that area, primarily the fatty clay soils of the former Beemster, Schermer, Purmer, Wormer, and other lakes. What is striking about this segment is that it directly pairs the typical landscape of Holland, characterized by the rectangular polders that had replaced the biggest lakes throughout the 17th century with its gardens. The polder landscape served primarily as land that provided the growing population of Holland with space for agriculture. But from the onset, it was also imbued with philosophical and theological ideals derived from the narrative of recovering a true and harmonious nature from the chaotic and dangerous waters. Throughout Western Europe, it was argued in the 17th century that nature untouched by man was a lesser nature and that the economy of nature was best where man actively superintended it. Untamed or brute nature, wilderness, resonated with the chaotic state of the world after the fall of man, disrupting the harmony of the elements. The polder landscape, then, was also a way to rise up to the challenge of recovering this divinely created balance, adapted to the particular conditions of the Low Countries. The Dutch power to create their own lands was also strongly tied to their efforts to unify against the Catholic Spanish hegemony. Consequently, the cultivation of these lands inherently carried early state identity building values with it. The popular 17th century poet Jacob Cats, in a poem on the country life from the second quarter of the 17th century, encouraged Stadtholder Frederick Hendrik of Orange, a sovereign much inclined to planting, in his words, to turn barren grounds into a handsome arbor or pleasure garden. This was truly princely work, in the words of Cats, that benefited not just one individual, but the fatherland in general. Cats was evoking here the origin myth of the Low Countries that had become popular in the 16th century. The creation of the polder landscape was not only about recovering a prelapsarian nature, it was also about recreating the land of the Batavians. The Batavians were people that lived in the great river delta of the Low Countries. They were described by the first century Roman historian Tacitus, whose works were rediscovered by early modern humanists like Erasmus and Cornelius Aurelius. Especially the revolt of the Batavians, described in the year 69 and 70, against Roman rule, found new resonance in the young republic because of the perceived similarities between that ancient struggle and the republic's intertwinement of the cultivation of new land with the recovery of ancient history, made that the Low Countries, and in particular the poldered province of Holland, came to be known as a garden, the Hortus Batavus. 17th century allegorical depictions of the Republic, like the one pictured here, often show the Garden of Holland, presided over by the Dutch maiden and guarded by the Batavian lion. An illustration of the tensions between the Spanish Empire and the Dutch Republic from 1615 shows the Dutch maiden, crowned with a spire, seated at the far end of a formal enclosed garden, a Hortus Conclusus. The temple-like structure behind her represents the Batavian ruling power, where the united provinces, the three men on her left, and the friend of the fatherland, the one man on her right, come together. A knight representing the military kneels behind the united provinces to declare its loyalty to Holland. From her, a central axis points right to the Batavian lion, guarding, with the help of the fence of loyalty, woven from hazel or willow twigs, the entrance to the garden, in which the real spectacle happens. Note the multiple eyes on the lion's head, concretizing the unification of the provinces. The House of Orange, symbolized by the orange tree, is placed central in the garden, emphasizing its prominent role in Holland, but also making clear that the oranges served Holland and not the other way around. This is accentuated by the pyramid-shaped monument to the privileges that were guaranteed to the provinces, cities, and the citizens of the Republic. Pyramids were as well popular features in Dutch gardens, often placed in the middle of the flower beds and on the corner of paths. The orange tree is not particularly flourishing, hinting at the precarious state of the garden, threatened by the Spaniards, approaching the Batavian lion as a leopard and lurking in the corner, and you can see them lurking in the corner behind the fence. The two gardeners that represent might and reason are planting and tending to some indistinguishable floral grass and crop shapes. The planting beds are closed in with small border scrubs, as is the whole garden, resembling the diked in polder landscape of Holland. The popular image of the Hortus Batavus thus alluded to the theological and philosophical qualities of Holland's landscape and its multifaceted cultivation, as well as to the creation of a new state, all at once. At the same time, the physical landscape started to carry with it the same connotations that were, on the one hand, typical for Western Europe in the 17th century, but on the other hand, adapted perfectly to the landscape of Holland. The polder landscapes, as the hinterlands of the city of Holland, turned into an Arcadian realm where polder villas arose from former farms, complete with orchards, avenues, copses, kitchen and ornamental gardens, and water features. The Dutch in the 17th century were a global power with an empire that stretched from far East Asia to the North and South Americas. My argument here is that the Hortus Batavus, exactly because this metaphor speaks to how the Dutch saw the world, can be applied to its whole empire. The different planting beds then represent different areas or colonies within the empire. This stresses both the systemic, curated top-down character of empires as well as its interconnectedness. Not unlike a Hortus conclusus, fenced off from the outside, European colonial settlements were designed as closed-off territories that intended to connect to the outside world only on the terms of the colonists. From an ecological perspective, plants and crops formed communities through networks of roots and fungi below the soil and pollen in the air, diffusing the garden's border. Furthermore, the sensory experience of the garden goes beyond mere sight. The spatial characteristics of sound, smell, and vision are very different. The smell of herbs and flowers and the sound of birds or wind rustling through plants, although they do require some manner of spatial immediacy, is carried for distance that far surpass the formal visual borders of the garden. This recontextualizes the image of the imperial Hortus Batavus into an infrastructure through which not only people and other animal species travel, but also plants, both planned and unplanned. While abstract, it's possible to make this concrete by looking at gardens planted throughout the empire. Van der Groen, the gardener of the House of Orange, claimed that Holland was blessed that both all the arts and sciences, as well as rare curiosities and delicacies, yes, treasures and riches, flow to her. His aim was, he wrote, to instruct his readers how they could maintain their pleasure gardens and decorate them with not only beautiful but also exotic trees, herbs, and flowers. The plants had to come from somewhere, and ideally without importing them from imperial powers. Gardens and plantations thus formed the infrastructure of Dutch mercantilism. Plantation gardens assembled cash crops native to the colonized region so they could be transported to the mother country. The Dutch East India Company traveled along a route of gardens, from the botanical gardens in Leiden, founded in the late 16th century, and Amsterdam, founded in the early 17th century, to the regions of Malabar, currently southwest India, and Batavia, Jakarta, Indonesia, with an important role for the supply and acclimatization gardens at Mauritius and subsequently the Cape, halfway between both worlds. This network of gardens was maintained by the Dutch East India Company, so they were planned to make money or support the making of money. The earliest designs of Dutch colonies were not as urban settlements. Instead, they consisted usually of a fort with grounds designated to garden and cultivate, in or just outside of the fort. When successful, within a few years or decades, a town would form around the original outpost. This depended for a large part on the maneuverability that was offered by local authorities to the Dutch or the room that the Dutch took by force. Batavia, for example, initially designed as a self-sustaining rendezvous outpost in 1619 for both the trade with Europe and the intra-Asian trade, grew significantly within a few years. The character of the town, though, was still dominated by the fort and the lands designated as gardens, farming grounds, and orchards. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602 with the floral world at its heart. After being shut out from the lucrative spice trade by the Portuguese and the Spaniards, private companies, mainly from cities in the coastal provinces of the young republic, set sail for the east to create their own trading networks. Competition between them, though, reduced potential profits, and local governments from the cities involved in the trade agreed to unite, with a charter granted by the Dutch States General. The Dutch East India Company was allowed to trade, wage war, make peace, and plant colonies east of the southern tip of the African continent and west of the Strait of Magellan. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, was a completely different story. The East India Company, after their Hudson-led expedition, was not interested in exploring the potential of North America any further. Hudson, in the end, was only employed to find an alternative route to East Asia. It again took private companies from the coastal provinces to take this up. Across the Americas, private companies traded with indigenous populations and other European colonists, while also assaulting Spanish and Portuguese trade ships in light of the Dutch-Spanish War. They eventually united, going forth as the Dutch West India Company in similar fashion to the East India Company, eliminating competition for the sake of profit. With the piracy on Spanish ships sailing between the South Americas, the Philippines, and Europe, bringing in the finances, the Dutch West India Company also established a network of settlements west of the southern tip of the African continent and east of the Strait of Magellan. Now again steps into focus the Hortus Batavus. First, because the Dutch West India Company was founded as a part of the resistance against Spanish oppression. Second, the grand design of the company was to expand the Hortus across the Atlantic Ocean, replacing Portuguese settlements. New Netherland would be producing foodstuffs. New Holland, Dutch Brazil, would supply Brazil wood that was used to produce red dye. And in the Dutch Caribbean and Guianas, as well as in Dutch Brazil, sugarcane plantations would be planted. They would supply their colonies with enslaved laborers from outposts on the Gold Coast of West Africa. It has been argued that while the formal and institutional gardens in the Republic served as microcosms of the Dutch reach and influence across the globe, their colonial counterparts primarily served the economic interests of the company. That is only part of the story. The network of gardens of the Dutch East India Company developed alongside the progression of the empire. When trading posts transitioned into inhabited settlements, garden culture took flight from providing nutrition or economic profit to additionally providing a home. The Dutch West India Company wanted to follow a similar business plan of trading without settling. But as it turned out, indigenous people on the African continent and in the Americas were not producing as many profitable crops or other products as those under the charter of the East India Company. The production of export products had to be organized by Europeans themselves. Here, settlements and plantations became essential to a successful colonial venture, and they required extra private investments that most individuals were not willing to pay. This eventually led to the downfall of the first West India Company later in the 17th century. Now, turning to New Netherland. The historian Ruth B. Wonka, in a rare study of plants and Dutch settlers in New Netherland, described the progressive development of New Netherland landscape management that consisted in part of preparing the land for Dutch plants and introducing the Dutch to New World soils, weeds, and cultivatable plants. In the early 1600s, the first settlements relied heavily on the trade with American Indians and European partners to supply their small farms with vegetables and medicine. A few decades later, houses in New Amsterdam and other small towns had private gardens with a variety of herbs, vegetables, and fruits. Indeed, the famous Castello plan, shown here, drawn by Johannes Vingboons around 1667 after a 1660 survey of Jacques Cortelyou, shows not only the buildings in New Amsterdam, but it also emphasized the importance of gardens in the city's domestic sphere and in the day-to-day business of the Dutch West India Company. Historians have been warned to be careful with the Castello plan and take into account that Vingboons had never set foot in New Amsterdam. It has been argued that for market purposes, the Castello plan depicted a far too neat image of the city instead of the small, muddy village that New Amsterdam actually was. Then, what can we make of the many gardens that are depicted on the map? Having a closer look, it is striking that the gardens take up so much space in the small town of New Amsterdam. Some 13 years later, in 1647, New Amsterdam's layout had been chaotic and allotted lands had been wasted, according to the director of New Netherland at the time, Peter Stuyvesant, and his council. The governing body had appointed surveyors to clean up the streets, and more importantly, it warned all and everybody who may heretofore have been granted lots that they must properly use their land. This indicates a top-down effort to spruce up the town, and the promotion of well-managed gardens that provided both food and pleasure might have been one of the ways to do this. Indeed, the Amsterdam directors of the West India Company sent a letter to Peter Stuyvesant upon having received the original Cortelius survey in December 1660, also written down on the screen. According to our opinion, two great spaces are as yet without buildings, where the houses apparently are surrounded by excessively large lots and gardens. Maintaining a critical outlook on the plan, this comment proves, I think, that Vingboon's placement of gardens is not random or merely a method to fill an empty space, but that he followed Cortelius' survey. Furthermore, a British interpretation of Cortelius' survey from 1664, known as the Duke's Plan, presents the excessively large lots as enormous green spaces with geometrically designed pathways to create planting beds. Whether all of New Amsterdam's gardens were as ornamentally designed as Vingboon's presented them, just some of them, or none at all, remains unclear and is a matter of historical interpretation. The strive for a well-cultivated settlement was not only a way to try and make New Amsterdam into a presentable Dutch outpost. It was also a way to establish self-sufficient vegetable and fruit gardens, securing the viability of the colonial town. This is something that happened all across colonial North America and was thus not a uniquely Dutch practice. In 1624 Jamestown, for example, it was punishable by fine to not properly fence your garden, and an unauthored text from 1635 argued that lands in the Massachusetts Bay Colony should be divided according to the individual means of cultivation, emphasizing the efficient improvement of the lands. On the Castello plan, there are a couple of garden elements that stand out: trees, rectangular planting beds, ornamentally designed layouts, and walls. From this, it is possible to discern at least 4 different kinds of gardens: agricultural plots for crops and grazing, personal kitchen and herb gardens, orchards with fruit trees, and ornamental pleasure gardens. So, most of the cultivated land within the city supposedly provided its inhabitants with food for sustenance, again emphasizing the effort to make New Amsterdam self-sufficient. In his description of New Netherland, Adriaan van der Donck mentioned plenty of American fruit-bearing trees and vegetables that could be found beyond the Dutch settlements. For example, mulberries, crab apples, strawberries, Jerusalem artichokes, and wild garlic. But he said the Dutch do not care for them because they brought over all kinds of garden fruits that fare well there. According to van der Donck, the orchards in New Netherland supplied the people with multiple variations of apples and pears, quinces, different types of cherries, yellow and black peaches, apricots, many types of plums, almonds, persimmons, figs, several kinds of currants, gooseberries, and licorice trees. He also saw a lot of potential for olives that had not yet crossed the ocean, and European grapevines that still needed a lot of horticultural experimentation to succeed. The fruit trees that figure so prominently on the Castello plan were amazingly successful in New Netherland. Jasper Dankaerts, who drew this sketch of New Amsterdam, and you can see if you look closely some trees hiding behind the houses that suggest perhaps orchards. So Jasper Dankaerts, when traveling through the land that was by then under English rule in 1679 and 1680, recalled in his journey that when he arrived in New York, he was welcomed with some of the fruit of the country, very fine peaches and full-grown apples of various kinds, and so laden with peaches and other fruit that one might doubt whether there were more leaves or fruit on them. I've never seen in Europe and in the best season such an overflowing abundance. Some trees were so heavy with fruit that they collapsed under their weight, and an orchard next to the road in New Haarlem, north of New Amsterdam, was so laden with peaches and apples that, fallen to the ground, they covered the field and blocked the road. After loading up and tasting the most delicious peaches we had yet eaten, he asked the boy why they left them lying there and did not let the hogs eat them. He answered, "We do not know what to do with them. There are so many. The hogs are satiated with them and will not eat any more. From this we may judge the quantity of them," he told. While narratives of full and plenty are usually interpreted as propagandistic promotional literature, I will argue something else here. It is clear that the intention of Dankaert's description of New Netherland as an overflowing basket with so much fruit that the inhabitants and even the farm animals do not know what to do with it anymore is an exaggeration. Dankaert was traveling through North America to find a place where he could create a colony for his Labadist community. So this element, the same as the literature of van der Donck in the poem of Jacob Steendam, this element is certainly there. What is interesting, though, is that studies of gardens in early Virginia have shown that fruit trees were bridges between the practical and the aesthetic. Fruit trees provided settlers both with the foodstuff they so desperately needed, as well as the sensorial pleasures of sight and smell. In the 19th century homage to wild apples, Henry David Thoreau considered apple trees the most beautifully flowering trees there were, so copious and so delicious to both sight and scent. New France presents a similar narrative with colonial gardens blending necessity with pleasure. Marc Lescarbot, a French lawyer who spent a year in 1606 and 1607 in current present-day Nova Scotia, recalled the pleasures of laying out and cultivating his garden, making parterres, aligning allays, building cabinets, sowing old and new world seeds, putting down roots, literally. Considering the cases of Virginia and New France, it's not unlikely that orchards in New Netherland served a similar function. Isaac Stokes' analysis of the Castello plan uncovers 3 important orchards that were planted in New Amsterdam by the time of Cortelyou's survey. One owned by the governor Peter Stuyvesant, one laid out by Augustin Herman, and one of the Dutch West India Company. According to the Castello plan, these orchards were carefully arranged in parallel rows, following contemporary gardening manuals. The Dutch physician and botanist Petrus Nijland wrote in the 17th century that the first duty of the gardener was to pick a proper location that provided him a fertile soil. Orchard stand required a good ground with dry soil on top of a wetter subsoil. Ideally, an orchard would have been fenced off with wind-breaking trees that protected it from spikes of cold and heat. Van der Groen, the gardener to the House of Orange, in turn instructed that to prepare the soil, it first had to be planted with cabbage for about a year. And you'll find cabbage throughout the archives of New Netherland. They cleared, according to him, the soil from poison and dirt. He offered 2 examples of how to plant an orchard, prefacing 200 models of geometrical garden design. One option was to place the trees in straight vertical and horizontal axis. The other was to place the trees in a cross pattern, called a quincunx Coincidentally or not, Stuyvesant's and Herman's orchards follow exactly these 2 models. While Dankaerts was partial to the apples and peaches growing in the orchards of New York, Van der Donck mentioned many more orchard fruits like cherries and quinces. Similarly, Arnoldus Montanus mentioned in his New and Unknown World that some crops sent over from Holland fare better here than in Holland, namely apples, pears, quinces, cherry, plums, currants, apricots, gooseberries, medlars, peaches, and also onions, apparently. The Castello plan provides no insight in the kind of trees that grew there. Pictured trees show no variation among them. The archaeologist Joel Grossman's analysis of the relatively scarce archaeobotanical records, an environmental time capsule, according to him, of New Amsterdam, shows both a continuity and change in the presence of different plants throughout the 17th century. Looking at the orchard trees, peach stones are found in sites from all periods, but while peaches came into the Americas through European explorations, they were adapted early on by American Indians and cultivated well before the settlement of New Amsterdam. It is unclear if the peach stones are evidence of Dutch peach orchards, thus. Cherry peach are found only in a site from the beginning of the 18th century, while 17th century writings suggest that they were already cultivated during the Dutch period. Just to give 2 examples. Surprisingly enough, Grossman did not find remains of apples, pears, or any other fruit that was commonly found in Dutch orchards. At least he did not mention them in his report. What was found in the site dating to the first half of the 17th century, though, was a single citrus seed, not mentioned by Montanus. This is interesting because citrus plants were not adapted to the climate of New Amsterdam. They do not tolerate temperatures that go too far below 50 degrees Fahrenheit and do not react well to frosted and salty soils. So how did a citrus seed end up there? Grossman suggested that perhaps the seed came from an early type of preserve imported from Europe, often mixed in a recipe with quinces. A recipe book from the 17th century, for example, called for circa 500 grams of quince juice, the juice of 2 lemons, and almost 1,500 grams of sugar to be cooked down into a syrup, coating cooked pieces of quince and lemon rind. According to the recipe, it was very good. Another option that Grossman put forward is that this citrus seed is possible evidence of more sophisticated horticultural experimentation. Because with glass houses or orangeries, it would have been possible to grow citrus trees in New Amsterdam. Considering the advanced state of Dutch horticulture in the 17th century, this is certainly an option. Built structures to create microclimates for the cultivation of Southern European and tropical foodstuffs were used in Dutch botanical gardens and prominent private gardens from the end of the 16th century. This went hand in hand with the expansion of the colonial empire and the urge to collect and display specimens that were not traditionally grown in the Netherlands. And as the rest of the Dutch global empire has shown, institutional and certain private gardens over there did not often lag far behind the gardens of the Republic, precisely because they played a key part in this network of gardens. In a letter from the third patroon of Rensselaerswijk, Jan Baptist van Rensselaer, to his brother and successor Jeremias from 1660, There's the slightest hint of such a built structure. Jan Baptist asked Jeremias to check on the cherry trees he had planted when he was in office in Rensselaerswijk, and he asked about something that was growing in an enclosure, and if it had borne fruit yet. What that something is was lost in the Great Archive Fire of 1911, and you can see the state of this document. It's very hard to discern the complete information. Additionally, David Pieterszoon de Vries, who had established a settlement on Staten Island and one on the west bank of the lower Hudson River around 1640, wrote that many lamoenen grew in New Netherland, suggesting that citrus fruits, limes in the Fries words, were available and even prominent. A type of fruit that's not mentioned by Grossman is the remarkable waterlimoen that appears often in the 17th century descriptions of New Netherland. Montanus, for example, wrote that the waterlimoenen, they taste nice and are healthy. When ripened, they grow to the size of an average cabbage. In modern English translations, it's often referred to as a watermelon. I argue that these translations are faulty. 17th century English texts dealing with the same type of fruit never referred to it as melons. The Scottish John Ogilvy's translation and also appropriation of Montanus' work calls them water lemons. And John Smith's first-person account on the settlement of Jamestown talks about the fruit as cultivated by the Powhatan people, a fruit that they called maracok, a wild fruit like a lemon. Indeed, it's a fruit native to North America, especially prominent in the southeast, but also hardy enough to have survived the winters in New Netherland. Today commonly known as the maypop, the Passiflora incarnata. Seeds may not have turned up from archaeological sites of New Netherland, but in Smith's Jamestown, 46 Passiflora seeds have been found in a 17th century well. Maypops, a fine plant species, sport intricate flowers with lavender-colored frilled petals and showy reproductive parts. The fruit is a large orange-yellow berry with edible pulp. Why Europeans refer to it as lemons is thus not so strange. That the Passiflora is mentioned by Dutch and English colonists does not mean that they cultivated it, of course. It establishes at least an exchange of botanical knowledge between American Indians and Europeans. Possibly Europeans were gifted fruits as an edible resource, or they saw local indigenous people harvest the fruit from naturally grown or planted plants, or even they were part of a socio-economic trade that strengthened their relations. Returning to the Dutch network of gardens, the 1727 plan of the company garden at the Cape Colony in southern Africa referred to a gazebo covered with passion flowers. Passion flowers are not native to southern Africa, but there are multiple species from the Americas now considered invasive in the country of South Africa. Perhaps the maypop traveled from American Indians through the hands of New Netherlanders to the Cape Colony. Already in 1605, the famous botanist of the Leiden Botanical Garden, Carolus Clusius, described the passion flowers, emphasizing its delicate flowers and tasteful fruits. Later in the 17th century, it was popular enough to be featured in Van der Groen's list of plants for pleasure gardens, in which he encouraged gardeners to keep passion flowers inside an orangery during the winter months. The passion flower serves as a nice segue into the next subject, flowers and pleasure gardens. While the colonists in New Netherland encountered a wealth of flowers they did not recognize, like with all other types of plants, Van der Donck also included a list of flowers that the colonists had in the past few decades brought with them to grow in their gardens. White and red roses of various types, peonies like the Rosa cornelis Vreeswijk, hollyhocks, several carnations like the Sweet William, many types of tulips, white lilies and imperial crowns, anemones, meadow saffron, violets, marigolds, and common lilacs. These flowers, as opposed to the types of fruit I talked about before, are not, as we would say, fundamental requirements to survive. So why would they take all this effort to bring over flowers when flowers native to North America were perfectly suitable to grow in gardens as well? Magnolias, sunflowers, red and yellow lilies like the trout lily and the Turk's cap lily, salsifys, differently colored asters, and many bell-shaped flowers like Virginia bluebells were also on Van der Donck's list of flowers known in New Netherland that were found in Dutch gardens, but native to the Americas. A letter from 1661 to Evert Janssen Wendel, a resident of Rensselaerswijk since the late 1640s, after having lived in New Amsterdam, from his family-in-law in current present-day Germany, the letter gives some insight. They sent him seeds to grow apple and pear trees, Roman lettuce, which they told him you must plant somewhat in the shade, and hollyhocks and bellflowers. They also noted that Wendel had requested some apples that grew in your blessed mother's garden. While emotions are rarely visible in the archival records of New Netherland, this letter gives a tiny peek into life in the colonies. Wendell was clearly missing certain elements from his life on the other side of the Atlantic, and sensorial experiences like the recognizable taste of a certain type of apple, or for that matter, the sight and smell of flowers that grew in gardens of the Republic, could soothe this pain. This is exactly what van der Donk's text tried to convey with the list of European vegetables, fruit, flowers, etc. That while living in a new world that provided everything you could ever want, you needn't worry about missing the essentials you were used to. But evidently, people still did. With this in mind, it has become clear that colonial gardens did more than supply food. They also supplied the colonies with the ingredients to feel at home. Most families probably grew flowers in the kitchen gardens behind their houses, in their dooryards, or along paths. Wealthier people, however, probably have brought with them, besides their plants, also the Dutch garden style, to carefully arrange such flowers. So returning to the Castello plan, there seems to be at least some truth in the ornamentally designed gardens, with flower parterres. Perhaps not as many as are shown on the plan, but we can be reasonably sure that there were some. Maps of the 18th century, like the one of the French cartographer Jacques-Nicolas Belin from 1764 or the famous Ratzer survey from 1776, picture New York as similarly gardened as the Castello plan. And looking beyond Wall Street, the many gardens of the Stuyvesants and the farm of, for example, Nicolas Bayard, a Dutch slave trader and mayor of New York from 1685 to 1686, showed a Dutch classicistic garden layout that was established in the late 17th century, around the time of Cortelyou's original survey, a style rooted in squares. On the Castello plan, gardens are pictured as areas with paths, outlining central beds shaped like diamonds, circles, ovals, and even some four-lobed flowers. Larger gardens, like those of Peter Stuyvesant, the West India Company, and next to City Hall, show the typical Dutch style of compartmentalization into squared planting beds that was easy to adapt to the available space. Dutch gardens were typically started out from a central path that created two planting areas. Ideally, another path was laid out to create 4 patches, but the size of the available land could restrict this to 2, or even demand 6, or 8, or even 12 patches. Another path will be laid out around those, allowing to walk on all sides of the planted grounds. Trees would also have to be planted around, protecting the garden from gusts of wind. Within the rectangularly shaped patches, variations in design could be applied, depending on their projected use. For herbs and vegetables, straight planting beds would be created, while ornamental flower planting beds would have been more elaborate. A perfect example of this is the formal garden just beyond the city wall that protected New Amsterdam, laid out by Jan Pietersen Verbrugge. This is exactly how the ideal garden of Jan van der Groen would have looked like. It is interesting that the period of New Netherland falls right in between 2 major contributions to Dutch garden architecture. I've been quoting a lot from Jan van der Groen's well-known The Dutch Gardener, the second part of The Pleasurable Life in the Country, shown on the right here. It's so The Pleasurable Life in the Country, in which are also bound the sensible gardener, the experienced housekeeper, the diligent beekeeper, and the sensible cook. From the sensible cook also comes the quince and citrus recipe. This compilation of works was published in 1669, a few years after the Castello plan, and marked the gradual displacement of the Mannerist influence on the decorative arts of the Renaissance by the more sober aesthetics of Dutch classicism. Dutch classicism, founded in squares, deemed mathematical perfection and displaying a Protestant clarity and order. The time-defining work of the Dutch Renaissance gardens is Hans Vredemans de Vries' Hortorum from 1583, shown here on the left, one of the earliest published garden pattern books. The Vries garden models show highly intricate beds planted with single specimens intended for the display of exotic plants that have begun to pour into Europe. In general, despite the elaborate ornamentation of its parts with statues, urns, fountains, mazes, topiary trees, and more, these gardens were simple in their layout, prefacing the garden models of the 17th century. In part, it was due to the geography of the Dutch Republic's landscape. Its flat and wet character restricted the popular extravaganza of Italian and French gardens that required height differences for spectacular waterworks. The Castello plan shows a mixture of Van der Groen's and de Vries garden styles. I've mentioned the compartmentalization of gardens just before, but what also shines through is the classicistic harmoniousness of the layout. During the 17th century, Dutch gardens transitioned not only in its architectural style, but also in the way they were being made. This is evident by just looking at the authors of Hortorum and the Dutch gardener. De Vries was an architect. Van der Groen was a gardener. The characters of both books reflecting this transition thus vary enormously. Hortorum is descriptive, showing finished designs of hypothetical gardens in different styles. It's almost a manifesto showcasing how formal gardens should be designed. The Dutch gardener, in turn, is instructive, showcasing instead how to make a garden and how to create ornamental flower beds. In a way, this democratized gardening, stepping away from architects and lowering the barrier for creating a formal garden. This has probably everything to do with the growing wealth in the Republic and the increasing importance of Dutch horticulture. Especially the Garden of the West India Company, established before 1638, is pictured with the De Vriesian characteristics. Note, for example, the single tree specimens, perhaps displaying trees from other outskirts of the Dutch Empire. What is also interesting to note is that in the garden are the two small buildings placed within the complex. The one sitting on the central axis has been identified as probably the garden house, meaning that the head gardener could have lived there and that perhaps it was used for storage. The peaked roof building, in turn, was probably a dovecot, providing meat and eggs. These buildings are interesting when thinking back of the possibilities of citrus plants in New Amsterdam. The garden house could also have served as an orangery or winter garden, storing plants that were not suitable to its northern Atlantic climate during colder months. So, to conclude, it is plausible that whatever ideas for garden designs arrived in New Netherland with 17th century planters arrived in New Netherland, that they derived from the contemporary fashion. Geometric formality in the shape of square or rectangular garden areas, divided into quadrants or split into two halves by a central path, or laid out in some sort of balanced or symmetrical scheme and enclosed by fences, is evident in 17th century New Amsterdam. But whether it was consciously adapted to the Dutch tradition is debatable and a matter of historical interpretation. I've argued for a yes here, although the level of consciousness is difficult to grade. In the case of Virginia, the garden historian Peter Martin argued that the intricate flower gardening of the Tudor and French styles was certainly economically beyond the planter. It would have struck him, in the middle of his other household and estate concerns, as a tasteless extravagance. Dutch gardening in the classicistic area, however, was heavily influenced by Dutch Protestantism and therefore, by its very nature, avoiding extravagant designs. There can be no doubt that the geometric regularity evident in one way or another in most 17th century New Netherland gardens was a manifestation of the gardener's practical need to efficiently protect and control the gardening that he or she was doing. But if at the same time they could satisfy themselves that to some extent they were recalling images and ideas inherent in the garden of the Dutch Republic, then all the better. The mapping early New York project of the New Amsterdam History Center has made a 3D reconstruction of the company garden in New Amsterdam, partly based on the archaeological work of Joel Grossman. In the reconstructed garden, the aesthetics of the De Vriesian garden design fused with the plantings of foodstuffs. Both European and indigenous American crops with bright orange pumpkins or pale green cabbages planted, where traditionally flowers would be bringing color and smell. Considering the aesthetic value of blossoming fruit trees in colonial gardens, this might as well be a hypothetical hybrid that served the need for nutrition and nostalgia. This is not necessarily my interpretation. I do think that, especially concerning the archival material I mentioned, that ornamental flowers played a bigger role than the reconstruction suggests. But I wanted to highlight this to show that as more resources and technical capabilities become available over time, the interpretation of the gardens on the Castello plan can go in many exciting directions. I'm excited to see what their current reconstruction project I learned about when I talked to them on the garden of the apothecary Hans Kierstede will yield. So thank you. That was it. I just wanted to end with this picture of I just got back from Montreal for a research trip, and I visited Chateau Ramezay, and they have a reconstructed 18th century garden, colonial garden. So I wanted to show in the flesh what it might have looked like, but this is a French style. And also the walls were, as Peter Martin argued, were there out of necessity, but why not make use of it and plant espalier fruit? So yeah, these are things of historical interpretation that we do not know at the moment, but yeah, I'm interested to see what I can find, as this is still a work in progress for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jonas. This was a great talk. We're gonna have a small time for questions and answers now. So if you'd like to put a question in the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom, please go ahead and do so. So we do have a question already waiting. With all the plants and trees the Dutch put in more than 300 years ago, when can we call something a native plant today? How far back counts?
That's a very good question. And as a humanist, I do not like to use native or invasive as a kind of plant category. I think I think it's, I'm not sure where it is. There somewhere in the US. There's currently there's an exhibition on this, on the use of invasive species. But no, so I think it's a term that's useful for ecologists, but we have to be very careful to use the term because it's also a kind of violent term. But that's a good question. I don't know. And you could even say, if humans are part of the natural world, then why is it not natural that when a plant is brought with a human to some other place? But yeah, no, that's a good question, and I do not have a proper answer to that. Yeah, but that's a great question.
Great. Yes, sorry. I think I said the chat box earlier, but I meant the Q&A box, so thank you. We have another question. Did you mention Dr. Hans Kierstad at the end? Did he have a medicinal garden?
Yeah, he had a medicinal garden. And so this is, I hope to have more articulated ideas about different types of gardens, but there were for sure apothecary gardens. So Hans Kierstad is one, that's a very famous one. So the New Amsterdam project is, or the New Amsterdam, so what's it called? The mapping early New York of the New Amsterdam History Center is currently working on a recreation of that garden. I don't know if it's physical or digital. So there's also another from the apothecary of Johan Kerspaal. He had also had a apothecary or medicinal garden, and he in the records. So in botanical works from the 17th century, it's very like, it's a deep dig into Latin or early modern Dutch text, but you can find some references. So there's the flower that kind of interested me, that I want to work on, but I've not done any research on, is the Aster Novi Belgii. So named after New Belgium, which was a synonym for New Netherland. So Johan Kerspaal, who had an apothecary garden in New Amsterdam and New York. He sent over two types of Aster Novi Belgii to the botanical garden in Leiden, and they're listed as growing there successfully. And also Johannes van der Laat in 1640 has transplanted at least two types of plants to the botanical garden in Leiden. But yeah, Kierstede is also a medicinal garden that I have not dealt with in this talk now.
Great, thank you. Are there any records of tulips being planted in the early days of New Netherland?
I don't know if there are any records of them, but Van der Donck clearly mentioned them, and they were very, very popular. So I'm sure there were. Yeah, I have not found any explicit records of them, but just they are there in descriptions of New Netherland and the flora that are being used there in gardens. So I guess so, yeah.
Great. That is very interesting to me. It's fascinating to see what important things from the Netherlands were brought to New Netherland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there any work or inspiration from Netherland gardens when they designed Central Park? Are you aware?
I am not aware. No, I don't know. Is there? I've not been to New York City. I've been there twice, but not really. I don't know if are there any formal gardens within Central Park? Not right. I think not.
There's one formal garden within Central Park in the on the Fifth Avenue side in the 100s, and it's called the Central
Okay.
Park Conservatory Garden. And there
Okay.
are beds with tulips there around a fountain, but that's the only formal garden
Yeah.
in
So I
Central.
mean that might be a Dutch like heritage kind of thing. I'm not sure. But even so, I mean, for this you can return to the native discussion. Tulips came not from the Netherlands; they were brought into the Netherlands from Central Asia, Turkey, through the Ottoman Empire, and
Mhm.
then, but you know, they were claimed as Dutch as a kind of cultural thing. So other than that, I'm not sure about the inspiration for Central Park now.
Hmm. Um, well, there is a Dutch garden in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, the Queen
Yeah,
Wilhelmina Garden. So if anyone is in San Francisco, there's also a windmill there.
that's cool.
Yeah. And then the last question is, where are the tiles in your title slide from?
I go through this very quickly. Go back. They are at the Albany Institute of History and Art. And I did ask, so there are gift, they were gifted as a collection in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, I think, or somewhere in the 20th century. And I sent the conservator an email asking about this, if they were in New Netherland at the 17th century, but he thought not, they were not sure. I have an article on the floor tiles that I have not yet read. I have it in my computer ready to be, but I think there's no evidence that they were actually made or made in New Netherland or shipped to New Netherland in the 17th century. I think there were just family private collections that ended up in a museum. But I mean I agree, I do love them, but they're there. So it's in the top left of this slide. You can see where they are.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And then speaking of tiles, we are going to be hosting an event for a new book about Delft tiles that were found in New Netherland called Beyond Blue and White. And this is by Genevieve Wheeler Brown. We'll be hosting that talk in person at the Lotus Club on Saturday, October 25th, in advance of the dinner dance that evening, which will be in honor of Louise Mirrer, the president of New York Historical, New York's first museum. So save the date for that. Jonas, thank you so much. We've recorded this talk, so we'll be putting this on YouTube. And Jonas is also contributing an article to De Havelman, so stay tuned.
Thanks all for being here.
Thank you.